The war that destroyed 4 empires and changed the world, forever one teenager. One pistol. One wrong turn on a quiet street in Europe. And within weeks, the entire world was at war. Millions of young men would march to the front lines believing the war would be over in a few months. Most of them would never return home. But here is the disturbing truth that still divides historians today. World War I might never have happened. Yet because of political pride, secret alliances, and a chain of catastrophic decisions, more than 20 million people would die. And when the war finally ended, something extraordinary had happened. 4 of the most powerful empires on Earth had completely vanished. The mighty Ottoman Empire, the powerful Austro-Hungarian Empire, the rising German Empire, and the centuries-old Russian Empire. Empires that had ruled millions for centuries, collapsed in just 4 years. So how did one assassination trigger the destruction of entire civilizations? And could this war have been stopped before it began? The day that changed the world. The story begins on June 28, 1914. In the city of Sarajevo, crowds gathered to watch a royal motorcade pass through the streets. Among the spectators was a 19-year-old nationalist named Gavrilo Princip. His target was one of the most powerful men in Europe, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Earlier that morning, another assassin had already attempted to kill the Archduke with a bomb. But the attack failed. The Archduke survived. At that moment, history could have changed. The royal motorcade could have left the city. Security could have tightened. The day could have ended peacefully. Instead, something almost unbelievable happened. Later that day, the Archduke's driver made a wrong turn. By pure coincidence, the car stopped just a few meters from Gavrilo Princip. The young assassin stepped forward. 2. Gunshots echoed through the street. Within seconds, the Archduke and his wife were dead. At first, the assassination seemed like just another political crisis. Europe had experienced many before. But behind the scenes, powerful alliances were preparing for war. Europe's dangerous alliances by 1914. Europe had become a continent divided into powerful alliances. On one side stood Germany and Austria-Hungary. On the other stood Russia, France, and eventually Britain. These alliances were supposed to prevent war. Instead, they made it almost inevitable. When Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia for the assassination, it declared war. Russia quickly mobilized to defend Serbia. Germany responded by declaring war on Russia. Then France entered the conflict, and when Germany invaded Belgium, Britain declared war as well. Within a matter of days, nearly all of Europe had been pulled into the conflict. What began as a regional dispute had turned into a global war. But here is the question historians still debate today. Did Europe truly stumble into war by accident, or were powerful leaders already expecting it? The illusion of a short war. When soldiers first marched to the front lines in 1914, many believed the war would end quickly. Crowds cheered as young men boarded trains for the battlefield. Some soldiers even brought footballs and musical instruments with them. They expected the war to last only a few months. Many believed they would be home by Christmas. Instead, they were entering one of the deadliest conflicts in human history because modern technology had transformed warfare in ways no one fully understood. Machine guns could fire hundreds of bullets per minute. Heavy artillery could destroy entire cities, and new inventions like airplanes and submarines were beginning to change combat forever. Within months, the war had reached a brutal stalemate. Life and death in the trenches across the Western Front. Both sides dug enormous trench systems stretching hundreds of miles. These trenches became the soldiers' homes, and for many, they would also become their graves. Life in the trenches was a nightmare. The ground was constantly soaked with rain and mud. Rats crawled through the trenches, feeding on food scraps, and sometimes on the dead. Disease spread quickly, and the smell of decay filled the air. Day and night, artillery shells exploded across the battlefield. Soldiers lived under constant threat of death. Yet the most terrifying moment came when commanders ordered an attack. Soldiers would climb out of their trenches and charge across open ground toward enemy machine guns. This deadly area became known as no man's land. Crossing it was often a death sentence. Entire battalions could be wiped out in minutes. One of the most infamous battles was the Battle of the Somme in 1916. On the first day alone, the British Army suffered nearly 60,000 casualties. It remains one of the bloodiest days in military history, and after months of fighting, the front lines had moved only a few miles. This raised a disturbing question that historians still debate. Did military leaders truly believe these attacks would succeed, or were millions of soldiers sacrificed in battles that could never be won? The war becomes global. Although much of the fighting took place in Europe, World War I quickly spread across the globe. Colonies and distant nations were pulled into the conflict. Battles erupted in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Millions of soldiers from across the British Empire joined the war. India sent more than 1 million troops. Australia and New Zealand sent tens of thousands. For New Zealand alone, nearly 10% of the nation's entire population served in the war. It was an extraordinary sacrifice for a small country. Meanwhile, new and terrifying weapons appeared on the battlefield. Poison gas drifted silently across trenches, choking soldiers who had no protection. Submarines hunted ships beneath the ocean surface, and airplanes began fighting battles high in the sky. The world had entered a new era of industrial warfare, and the human cost was staggering. The beginning of the end by 1917, the war had already lasted far longer than anyone expected. Millions were dead. Economies were collapsing, and political unrest was spreading across Europe. The first empire to collapse was the Russian Empire. Years of military defeats, food shortages, and economic crisis triggered a revolution. The Russian monarchy was overthrown. Soon, the country plunged into civil war. Meanwhile, in Germany, the strain of war was becoming unbearable. Food shortages caused widespread suffering among civilians, and protests began to erupt across the country. In 1918, the German government realized the war was lost. The German emperor abdicated the throne. The powerful German Empire had fallen. Soon after, the Austro-Hungarian Empire also collapsed. For centuries, it had ruled over many ethnic groups across Central Europe. But as the war ended, those groups declared independence. The empire shattered into several new nations. Finally, the once mighty Ottoman Empire also began to disintegrate. For more than 600 years, it had controlled vast territories across the Middle East and southeastern Europe. But the war left it weak and divided. Within a few years, the empire disappeared entirely. In just 4 years, the political map of the world had been transformed. The peace that created new problems in 1919, world leaders gathered in France to negotiate peace. The result was the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty forced Germany to accept responsibility for the war. It demanded massive financial reparations. It drastically reduced Germany's military power. And it took away large portions of German territory. Many leaders believed these harsh punishments were necessary to prevent future wars. But some warned the treaty was dangerously unfair. They believed it would create anger and resentment inside Germany. Those fears would later prove correct, because the economic collapse and humiliation that followed helped fuel political extremism. And within 2 decades, Europe would once again descend into war. The war that changed everything. By the time the guns finally fell silent in 1918, the world had changed forever. More than 20 million people had died. Entire cities had been destroyed, and four of the most powerful empires in history had vanished. But perhaps the most tragic truth was this. World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars. Instead, it became the beginning of an even greater disaster, because only 21 years later, the world would once again fall into global conflict, World War II. And many historians believe its roots began right here, in the unresolved tensions left behind by World War I. Final thought today, more than a century later, the questions remain. Was World War I truly inevitable? Could diplomacy have prevented the disaster, or was the world already heading toward war? What we do know is this. In just 4 years, a single conflict destroyed empires, reshaped nations, and changed the course of human history forever. And it all began with 2 gunshots on a quiet street in Sarajevo.